Amen and amen. You may be seated. Hey, welcome to Belong Church. Hey, before you grab a seat, give someone a high five real quick. Just say hello to somebody close to you. Thanks for coming to church. Well, if you are just joining us for the first time, we're all new here. This is only our 5th week as a church, and I just love the fact that we're all new here, and I just think that's a very special moment to be really at the beginning of something. And we call ourselves Belong Church because we're a community where everyone belongs and many believe. And we want to make a space for no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, that you have a spot here, that you belong. And we're going through a sermon series right now entitled In His Strength. What would it look like for you and I to enter into our workplaces and into our school environments, not on our own strength, but in a different strength? And we're taking a look at this moment in the story of God where if it hadn't been for this guy Hezekiah, whose name actually means in his strength, if it hadn't been for this man not leaning on his own wisdom as a king, not leaning on his own counsel or on his own army, but rather leaning on God and being strengthened by God, honestly, the story of God wouldn't have continued. And so this young man, the first few weeks, here's what we've covered so far, just so you kind of have an idea of where we're at, is that this man takes upon the throne, and his dad was a really bad dude. He had closed all the churches. He had made some things really difficult for the people of the land. And so when he takes the throne, this guy, King Hezekiah, the very first thing he does is he opens all the churches. And he opens the churches even though he's got 100 other things to do. He could make sure that the people have water. He could make sure that the army's good and strong. But he says, look, all those things are second and third place before we put God first. And the first week, we really focused in on how we ought to seek God's kingdom first. And as a church, man, let's just seek God. And everything else is going to follow. And then last week, we took a look at how this guy, he invited everybody to celebrate what was called the Passover, which is a celebration of God's grace. And he sent messengers throughout all of the region. And most of the people, they just kind of laughed at him. Like, oh my goodness, the church has been closed for 15 years. Why would I ever go to church? I'm not going to go to church. But a few people came and they celebrated Passover. And we took a look at how it says that God healed the people. So this week, I want to focus in on how Hezekiah realized this one principle. That in order to change the whole world, you first must change yourself. Okay, if you're taking notes, and I see a few note takers, if you want to change the whole world, you first must change yourself. Now, if we could take a look at this first slide, listen to what Hezekiah says, and I underlined the most important part. He says, "Hear me, Levites." Now, the Levites were a group of people who were dedicated to serving in the church. They were like the pastor's family, if you will. He says, "Consecrate yourself." That is to say, set yourself apart. Get ready. Okay? Start praying. Start seeking after God. Like, you get ready. Consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers. Carry out the filth of the holy place. We took a look at this. For our fathers have been unfaithful and have done what is evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him and turned away their faces from the habitation of the Lord and turned their backs. He's like, guys, generations before us, they didn't seek God. They didn't take the first day of the week, Sunday, the first moment. They didn't wake up and say, you know what, God, I'm going to go to the house of the Lord. And he's like, we're going to change that. We're changing the culture of this place. And guys, I want you to know this, that I know that some of you're just sitting in a metal chair in a gym. No, you're not. You're in the house of the Lord. And you're prioritizing in this moment the fact that you've been created by God, the fact that you have a destiny. Right now, you are setting your whole week. You're setting the tenor of your whole week. It's so important what we're doing right now. You think the darkness, you think the spiritual realm likes what we're doing? No, not at all. A group of people gathering together to lift high the name of the Lord. Hezekiah's like, yo, listen, our dads, the previous generations, Sunday morning, they were sleeping in. They weren't going to church. They weren't seeking after God, but that's about to change. For behold, our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. Let me just explain what's happened. He's obviously referencing a historical moment. And here's the historical moment, that in Hezekiah's generation, what happened is this guy, Sennacherib from Assyria, came through and took like 1 million people to Assyria. They were in captivity. And Hezekiah is making a connection. He's like, yo, listen, all the bad stuff that's happening to them ultimately happened because generations before, they made some poor decisions. And they're reaping the rewards, which are not good rewards, from their poor decisions. And so I don't know about you, but as a father, and some of us are parents here in the room, can I see a show of hands? How many of us are parents? A lot of parents in the room. Our kids are taking a PhD in you. They're just studying you, aren't they? They're just looking at you. They're just watching you. And many times they repeat what we do, right? Many times I'll be like, Jet, like, why are you doing that? And I'm like, wait, you're me. You're like a mini me. Like, why am I judging you? Like, I need to lead you and teach you on how to not do that. Well, Hezekiah is like, listen, we're gonna change the culture. We're gonna seek after God. And then here's the principle. Here's what I want you to catch. Now, it is my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, in order that his fierce anger may turn away from us. Hezekiah recognizes this. So you get this King Sennacherib demolishing every nation. And he's coming towards Hezekiah. Slowly but surely, he's going to be knocking on Hezekiah's door and taking all of his wives, all of his strong men, his philosophers. They're all going to Assyria. And Hezekiah knows this. Before he tries to strengthen his army, before he gets to, he needs to do one thing, right? He needs to change his heart. He recognizes this principle that in order to change the world, he himself, the king, seeks to make a covenant with the Lord. And then he says this, my sons, don't be negligent. Remember, he's talking to the Levites. He's talking to the people who are serving in the church. For the Lord has chosen you. Everybody say chosen. I want you to know that you're chosen. That if you are here in this place on a Sunday morning, that you might be going, I'm choosing God. This is the moment I'm choosing God. Let me just remind you, Jesus in the New Testament, anytime Peter and John kind of had a moment where they could pat themselves in the back because they did the right thing, Jesus always says this. He says, remember, Peter, you didn't choose me, buddy. I chose you. And before you and I say, I'm making my way to the Lord, I'm choosing God, God's like, it's cute, but I chose you. You're chosen. You're sealed for the Lord. You're chosen to stand in his presence, minister to him, and to be ministers and make an offering to him. If we can go to the next slide real quick, here's what I want you to notice. Change the world by first changing yourself. What you see in the story of King Hezekiah, if you read 2 Chronicles 29 all the way through 32, okay, it's only 3 chapters, but they're long chapters. What you're going to see is this, is that Hezekiah first is like, yo, I need to change. My dad was a real bad dude. I'm going to change my heart for God. And then what ends up happening is the Levites and the priests around him, they're like, man, the king's changing. The king's making moves. We're going to make some moves for God. The Levites and the priests, they start getting after God. And then the temple in 16 days gets purified and cleaned. Then all the people, they come to Jerusalem, and then all these old idols that were set up for terrible things, some of them for child sacrifice, some of them for, I won't even get into it, but just terrible, terrible things. They start going in and they see the temple, and the temple's so beautiful and pure and joyful and life-giving. And they start looking around Jerusalem and they're like, man, that statue ought to go. Man, that altar, man, what is that doing here? And what happens is they clean out all of Jerusalem and they celebrate Passover. And then what ends up happening, the people, they go back into the towns. And the towns are just the surrounding regions like Bethany and Bethel that are like kind of around Jerusalem. And then they're looking at Jerusalem like, yo, man, what do we got this altar for, man? Why are we doing these things, man? We got to clean up the towns. And the towns get cleaned up. And then what ends up happening is the cities way north of Jerusalem that are now a distance away, they get transformed. And all of the region gets changed and gets rededicated. There's a revival that arguably, I would say, changes the world. Why? Because you know that Sennacherib, this king, this evil king in Assyria, in England right now stands Sennacherib's prism. And we're going to get into this probably next week or 2 weeks when Sennacherib actually comes to Judah. And what's interesting is that on Sennacherib's prism, it's this arrogant, prideful essay about all of his escapades and all of his the ways that he demolished this and destroyed this. But then when he gets to Jerusalem, there's this moment of silence where Sennacherib says, "And I decided to turn around and go back home." And even like historian, there's something that happened here that Sennacherib's not talking about. You see, the faithfulness of Hezekiah changed the whole world. It's changed the trajectory of the whole world. And so what would it actually look like for us to believe that, listen, my devotional life to God isn't just for me. When I wake up and I choose to dedicate this day to God, when I choose to dedicate this week for God, sure, I am of primary benefit. But let me tell you this, your kids will be blessed. Your spouse will be blessed. Your coworkers will be blessed. Your teacher will be blessed. Because listen, when we see God together, when we see God, guess what? There's a ripple effect. And we see that in the story of King Hezekiah. Now, I asked my mother-in-law if I could share this story. She might be even better at telling it than me, but my wife and Tanny, they bought these panic alarms. There was probably about 2 years ago, there was some guy who was like going after girls and stuff like that. And so they bought these panic alarms. So if this guy showed up, they'd be just hitting this panic alarm and it'd just go off. I don't know, it just makes a loud sound. It doesn't fight the guy or anything. It just makes this loud sound, you know? And so she tells me a story where she was on her work break and she went across the street to like a Shoppers or something. And as she was grabbing a cart, unknowingly, she actually pulled the pin. And the thing is such a piercing sound that it's so piercing that it echoes and it's hard to like figure out exactly where it is because it's so piercing, which again, in a panic moment, don't you kind of want to know where it is? But it's so piercing, right? And so right away, she's like, oh my gosh, there's an alarm in Shoppers. And so she's walking around all of Shoppers thinking like someone's stealing something here. And yet it's going off in her purse, right? She goes and she pays for something and she's talking to this lady. She's like, what is going on? Is it a burglary or something like that? And then she's walking back to her workplace and she'll tell you that the whole buildings were echoing the sound. And she was just assuming that there was a crazy burglary, okay? There's just this alarm that is going off. And it wasn't until she walked back into the library, okay, where she worked, the library, the place that's super quiet, where here people start realizing that there's a sound in the library, right? And the first thing that the security man says is, there's a sound coming from you. And she says, and you can ask her, no, there's a burglar at Shoppers. There's a burglar at Shoppers. And the guy's like, what? No. And so he's, let me see that purse. Let me see the purse. And he finds the thing, finally. And it has such a difficult time. He can't turn it on. He has to take a hammer and smash this thing to pieces just for this thing to shut up, right? Listen, many times in life we can point to everywhere around us. So that's the problem. That's the problem. Oh, the problem's over there. Man, it's really bad over there. But what the scriptures actually tell us is that the problem many times, it starts in here, doesn't it? It's in here. And Hezekiah realizes this and he's like, yo, if I want to change the world, it needs to start here. And so friends, here you are at Belong Church. And I'm like, let's change the world. Honestly, I got a global vision for this thing. We're going to Maui in November on a missions trip. Come with us to Maui, come on. I feel called to Maui, let's go, you know? There's a 99-year-old chapel that needs some work. It's turning 100 years old next year. It's a friend of mine who's the pastor of it. He's like, I need a team in November. Let's go to Maui. Let's change the world. But listen, before we try and change the world, we first must ask the Lord to change our hearts. And I mean, we could end it right there. We could say, okay, Lord. And realize the thing is that's this mixture between God's grace and God doing the changing and us reciprocating that and saying, okay, God, I wish to change. Making that decision daily to say, okay, I want to try and be better today than that's it. That's all it is. And here's what I also want you to know is that here at Belong Church, man, I want you to know that no matter where you are in that journey, you belong here. Like when I'm at the skate park, I may be doing like what's called a crooked grind nollie kickflip out or like a really technical trick. And here's a kid who's just learning how to ollie, just to jump. And you think at that skate park, I'm like, man, where's your technical tricks? No, man, I'm like, yo, dude, I'm so glad you're here, bro. Oh, let me tell you that back foot, you just got to maybe put it that way, and then you're going to get a better pop, you know? Here at this church, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, just know that you belong. And that what I'm hopefully trying to get people to understand is this, is that can we try and do better next week than we did this week? Even as a church. Man, how can we get better? And not being religious about it. No, listen, we're all on a personal journey. I'm not trying to compare myself to anybody but myself. In the same way that at skateboarding, I'm not trying to compare myself to anybody than myself. Last thing I want to leave with us is Hezekiah is going to call for 3 things from his people, okay? And so he's like, yo, I want to change the world. And he's like, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I won't do myself. And that's the same thing that I will say to you. I'll look you in the eyes and listen, friends, those who are like, I am here to build this house for the Lord. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I, myself, wouldn't do. He's going to ask his people for 3 things. Time, talent, and treasure. Hezekiah is like, yo, here's what I need from you guys. Time, talent, and treasure. Let's go to the next slide. Time. This is what Hezekiah says. We don't have to read the whole thing, but we'll cover it. If you go to the next slide, please. We already looked at this, but first of all, he recruits messengers, and they go throughout all of these cities. And here's what he's asking for, firstly from his people, is for time. He says, yo, guys, you guys need to come down to Jerusalem for a week. You need to take a break from your workplace. You need to take a break from your schedule, and you need to come visit me because we've prepped the temple, we've started a church, and we need you guys to come down for a week. And so think about that for a moment. What happens? A lot of people, they start laughing at these people. You think I'm going to come down? You think I'm going to give you a week of my time? But Hezekiah realizes that, you know what's the most precious possession of ours? It's time. It's time. Time is your most precious resource. And one of the things that if you want to see your life absolutely transformed, if you and I want to see the world transformed, you know what it's going to take? It's going to take time. But you know what's really interesting is this. Check out this. Then they all show up. They all show up at the place. And then notice what the verse says at the bottom. The whole assembly then agreed to celebrate the festival 7 more days. For so another 7 more days they celebrated joyfully. Right? They'd already made the trip. They'd already set up church. And they're like, hey, round 2. Let's go. We're doing it again. You guys want to do another 7 days? Let's do another 7 days, you know? And then so they party for another 7 days and celebrate the Lord for a total of 14 days. If we want to change the world, it will require your time. And so I'm asking for you to consider, man, what would it look like for me to give God my time? Well, you're doing it right now. You're starting off your week by dedicating it to the Lord. I wanted to show a picture of what happened last night. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is our setup team. On Saturday nights, sacrificially giving of their time to set this up so that we can come back here in the morning and it's not a rush. We simply pray, we make coffee, and just wait for the people. And so I want to ask you, hey, how are you and I giving of our time? Secondly, he's going to ask you to give of your talent. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. It says this, Hezekiah appointed the divisions of the priests and the Levites, division by division, each according to his service, right? Notice that it says, each according to his service, the priests and the Levites for the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, to minister in the gates of the camp of the Lord and to give thanks and praise. And so here's what I want you to notice is that Hezekiah, what he's going to do is he's going to actually not just ask for time, but he's going to, according to each person's talent, he's going to assign them division. He becomes organized. He says, man, you're in charge of this area, you're in charge of this area, and he gives them each according to their talent. In the New Testament, Scott, if we can go to the next slide, listen to what Jesus says. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted them to his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1. Each one according to his ability. You know, the word talent actually is an ancient word for a form of currency. And so if you think about your talent, really your talent is a form of currency, right? And so God gives to each one a talent. Then he went away. And he who received the 5 talents went and traded with them. And he made 5 more talents. So he who had 2 made 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug into the ground. This is so sad. And he hid his master's money. So this person says, man, I only got 1 talent. And he got 5. And I only got 1. And you know what? I can't really do much with 1 anyways. So what he does is he goes and he digs a hole and he hides his talent. But he who had received, now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more, saying, Master, you delivered me 5 talents. Here, I have 5 more. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, and I have set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. My hope and prayer is that here at Belong Church, you would find a spot where your talent, the thing that God has given you, that you would apply it. Whether you're good with kids, whether you're good with just greeting people, you're a welcoming person. Here's some of our needs. Come September, I would love to start groups, community groups, Bible studies, meeting in homes. And so I'm looking for a person who really wants to organize that. We need a clear next steps program. So I want to start like a 3-week program that's held every 2 months, which really just after church, people go into a coffee shop and they get to hear about who is God, who is our church, and who are you. It's a 3-step program into figuring out really their talent, figuring out who is God and who is Belong Church. I'm looking for somebody who says, man, I'm willing to take that on, right? I'm looking for someone who is thinking about events. Like we want to host barbecues and stuff like that. And listen, I can try and do it all. But first of all, that wouldn't be healthy. And I think as a family, if we all step in all these different ways, we can change the world. And for you, you are participating in eternity. When you apply your talent, when you invest your talent with the Lord, I think what you're doing is what Jesus would say is you're actually adding to your heavenly purse, whatever that means. Jesus says, don't try and store lots of stuff in purses here on earth where moth destroys and rust destroys, but instead, seek the Lord, serve the Lord, and as you serve and you give to God, guess what? There's a purse in heaven, which we'll only find out what that is. Maybe it's eternal rewards of some sort. Maybe it's responsibility, but whatever it is, let's be clear of one thing, is that salvation is by grace, but eternal rewards, what we receive in heaven, there's a deep connection and correlation with what we do with our lives, which means that there's eternal accountability. Like, why do you think, I started this church because I want to change the world, but I also know that heaven's on my side. And heaven wants to see this happen. And so I'm looking for heavenly minded people who say, man, I'm willing to take my talent, my musical talent, my passion for kids, my passion for whatever it is, literally whatever it is, and I'm willing to give it to the Lord. Lastly is treasure. The contribution of the king of his own possessions were for the burnt offerings. Notice this. I want you to really notice this. Is the mic not working? That's okay. The king does not ask his people for anything that he himself won't commit to. The contribution of the king from his own possessions was for the burnt offerings, as it was written in the Lord. And he commanded the people who lived in Jerusalem to give the portion due to the priests and Levites, that they might give themselves to the law of the Lord. So the king's like, yo, listen, take a portion of what you have and bring it to the temple. Bring it to the church. And as soon as the command was spread abroad, the people of Israel gave an abundance of their first fruit of grain, wine, oil, and honey. Thank you, John. And all the produce of the field. And they brought in abundantly the tithe and everything. So the people were generous. In the 3rd month, they began to pile up in heaps and finish them in the 7th month. And Hezekiah and the princes came and they saw the heaps. They blessed the people of Israel. And Hezekiah questioned the priests and the Levites about the heaps. There's so much that the king's like, well, what is this stuff? Wow, like the people came through. Azariah, the chief priest, who was of the house of Zadok, answered him, since they began the contributions of the house of the Lord, we have eaten and had enough and plenty left. For the Lord has blessed his people so that we have had this large amount left. The house of God was so blessed. But here's what I want you to notice. Then Hezekiah commanded them to prepare chambers in the house of the Lord, and they prepared them. So about a year later after this, you know what happens? Is the enemy shows up. King Sennacherib shows up. And guess what? There is a siege of Jerusalem, which means these people are quarantined. It means that the enemy is on the outside of the city, and the king has done everything in his power to make sure that the people are cared for in the city. And there's a siege. There's a whole wall around. King Hezekiah, before this, he builds a tunnel for water, a hidden tunnel, so that people have water. And guess what? The people had food. Why? Because they brought it to the church. And so in this moment of critical crisis, where normally people would starve to death, who feeds the people? The church. And so it's this beautiful picture of bringing whatever you can, your time, your talent, and treasure, and knowing that you are protected from the enemy, that God is going to protect you. I know for me, there's been times where giving to God financially has been kind of a scary thing. I'll share with you one last story, and it's this. I remember my mom calling me one time. I was living in Canada. She was in Iceland. And she said, Dave, you didn't do your taxes for the year. I was doing drywall, and I made, I don't know, maybe $70,000 in a matter of like a year and a bit or something like that. Because I was doing drywall. It was heavy work, and I worked hard. And she says, Dave, you didn't do your taxes. I said, oh my gosh. Yeah, I didn't do my taxes. And she's like, you owe like a ton of money. I was like, oh no, And I was a Bible college student at the time. Didn't have any money. And I owed a few $1,000s to the Icelandic government. So I was like, either I'm never going to Iceland again, or I have to pay this. But my mom was like, no, but if you actually do your taxes, you could actually potentially get a return because you hadn't worked in Iceland for a few years and stuff. And so I was like, okay. So Mom, I'm pretty sure I just signed something and you did my taxes. Thank you so much, Mom. Gotta show love for the moms in the room. Thank you, Mom. And so, guys, like 3 days before I was actually getting on a plane to go to Iceland, now that I'd done my taxes, my mom calls me and she says, Dave, you actually ended up getting a piece of mail from the Icelandic government. I don't know if you remember this, but you actually got a check. Can I open it? I said, Mom, please open it. And she opened it, and there was a $1,500 check to a Bible college student. That's like $1 million, okay? In 2008, that's like $10 million, okay? And so I was so excited to go to Iceland to not only see my family, but to receive this tax refund. And one of the first things that I did when I go to Iceland is that I went to my childhood church called Vegurinn, which means the way. And sure enough, they had some incident. I think it was like the air conditioning, not in Iceland actually. It was something going on with their building that they needed some repairs, and they were doing a special offering. And the Lord very clearly said to me, hey, Dave, you just got a free $1,500. What are you going to do with that money there, buddy? And it was like the pastor was asking, I was like kind of going like this, like, And in that night, I'll be honest with you, that night at church, I didn't give. I didn't release. And I was in Iceland for like 2.5 weeks or something like that. And God was just kept saying, I kept like spending a bit of the money. And he's like, you gonna give any of that, And here's the thing. Does God need my money? Does God need 1/10 of that, $150? No. But does he want my heart? Yeah, he wants my heart. He wants the heart of this young Bible college student, and he wants to show him something. And so on the second to last day of my trip, I was driving past Veguden, and I pulled in, and I decided to give 1/10 of the 1,500, which was $150. Now, the following day I was leaving. I was going to the airport. And I had lived in Iceland previously, and my mom had my bedroom all set up this whole time. And she had gone to the point where it's like, Dave, you now live in Canada. You need to get your stuff out of here. You need to clean your room. And I had done that, and I had gotten all these garbage bags full of stuff, and I had thrown out a bunch of stuff in there. And I was leaving to go to the airport. I'd already got my bags packed. I was ready to go, and I was leaving towards exiting the door, and I see a CD, and it says Grad 2005. And I know what CD that is. Those are pictures from my grad. And so I said, I can't throw that out. And so I go and grab it, and I realize something. I need to get a CD cover for this. I need, just an old CD cover. And I realized that in the garbage, I had thrown out some old CD covers, just from the 90s. I got Spice Girls and Backstreet Boys and stuff like that. I'm like, got it on my MP3, And so I go through and I find an old CD cover and I open it up, and you know what's in there? $150 that I had hid from my sister. Because my sister kept coming in my room and taking some of my money. And so I put it in the Backstreet Boys CD. And I opened that up, and it was exactly what I had given to the church a day before. Now, does that happen every single time? No, it doesn't. But it was a glimmer in my life, at least, to say, God just saying, hey, trust me. Trust me. And I'll care for you, right? And so, with Belong Church, this is another test of mine. You might be wondering, who's funding this? Is there like a denomination behind us? Is there a rich guy somewhere, No, it's our family. We're funding this. Why? Because we believe that this is what God's called us to do. And so I'm asking for whatever you're able to. If it's a tithe, great. If it's 2%, great. 5%, whatever it is. But that you and I would participate in building the house of the Lord. Amen? And so if you go to the last slide, I just want to make it as easy as possible. God wants you to give time, talent, and treasure. And if you're feeling called to give, then it's very easy. You can either go to our website, which has a PayPal link, and that'll take a credit card or PayPal, MasterCard, that kind of stuff. Or you can e-transfer at give@belongchurch.com.